Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. I have to do a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce you to Kate. Obviously, I'm delighted to invite you to the Dixon Room today, including the many of you who are joining us by Zoom. It's hard to believe, but hundreds of people are actually also watching us on Zoom. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the traditional owners of the land, and we pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. As you've seen, we're following the COVID protocols today, and social distancing means that there are restricted numbers in this room. Hand sanitizer is available at the door. Please try to respect these protocols. We would like the festival to continue all weekend, and so we depend on you to do that. Mute your mobile phones, of course, and please don't record the session. If you are taking photos, please turn off your flash. You can, if you like, post your photos to social media. The hashtags are @BadCrimeSydney. We have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the discussion for questions. Now, if you are watching on Zoom, please do it through the Q&A function and not through the chat. That'll be about 20 minutes before the end of the session. The volunteers at the back will bring those questions up to me, and there'll be questions from the room as well. But Kate McClymont comes to us tonight fresh from a boozy event.
Michael Usher was
with
there
our colleague
last night.
Michael Usher from Channel 7 as well in the room, I understand, was also there last night, where she won yet another award, the Kennedy Award, for her groaning mantelpiece. Congratulations.
Thank you, Caroline.
To add to your Badass Award as well.
I think the Badass Award is the best thing I've ever won.
I like the little red bits in there. I'm wondering, do you think that's his liver or his?
I'm just wondering whether they are blood spatters.
Oh,
you can just see there's two red bits right in the middle. I don't know. I think definitely blood. Definitely. Stab wounds.
It's tremendous. You'll have to get a bigger trophy cabinet. Kate, the award last night was for the investigation, a Me Too investigation really, but centred on Dyson Heydon, a former High Court judge. It's quite the scalp, a former High Court judge. It's quite astounding. And I wondered if you could talk us through the story, but in particular, the risk that you must have faced of defamation.
Well, the Dyson Heydon story actually came to us 2 years earlier. And we were approached, I was approached by, in fact, I got an anonymous tip-off that Dyson Heydon should be in the Me Too category. So the first thing that you do is you always worry if you start ringing around, how long will it be before he finds out that you're doing something? Because you never know with the people that you approach, are they going to be on side or are they not? So we drew up a list of all the associates who had worked for Dyson Heydon, and we slowly started going through them. And it was during the course of that two of them said, that's absolutely what's happened to us. But the problem was that we had two on the record. We had another woman that, another associate, and her experience of Dyson Heydon was that he pushed her onto a bed and she literally had to fight him off. And that was a much more serious allegation. You know, it could have been an attempted sexual assault, but she absolutely refused. Not only did she refuse to go on the record, she refused to allow her story to be told at all. And she said, I've got a career. And the interesting thing about doing this story is you realise how many women are loath to complain because they are worried that they will be seen as serial complainers that no one will ever want to work with. So you've got these women were university medalists. They were the brightest young women in their cohort, and they felt they had nowhere to go to complain about Dyson Heydon. I just find that in itself fascinating. But anyway, so it's one of those things that Caroline will know this as well. Like with investigative journalism, it's a game of patience. You know, you have to be able to just keep chipping away at something. And we got more people. And then, lo and behold, the two of the original complainants got a lawyer and actually put in formal complaints to the High Court. And they then did that investigation, and the High Court very kindly gave us the investigation because we'd been instrumental in the first place. But the sad thing is if that High Court investigation hadn't happened, or in fact, if the Chief Justice, Susan Kiefel, had not come out and said, we are ashamed of what's happened, etc., our lawyers would never let us run that story. You're probably here all aware of, you know, what happened with the Jeffrey Rush story, and also one of our earlier Me Too movements with Craig McCliment is still before the courts. So he was actually charged criminally. And in fact, he was in court last week and he was told to stop singing some of his evidence. So, a performer to the last. So, you know, it's one of these things as a journalist. It's hard to explain how much we can't write because of our legal advice. I did a story last weekend about a well-known footballer, you know, who had sex in the public toilets at Brisbane Airport, and then when the woman's husband found out, he went berserk, and so the football manager gave him some Valium to calm him down, and then as a truck driver, he tested positive to benzodiazepine, and then the club doctor covered it up for him. Like, just, you can't make this stuff up. But anyway, our lawyers said you cannot, even though the person's name was in the complaint to the NRL, because strangely enough, it's a criminal offence to have sex in a public toilet. It's considered an act of public indecency. So the fact that the footballer might have committed a criminal offence was something that if you're a registered NRL official, you have to report that because it could bring the game into disrepute. But our lawyers said, what, have you got CCTV footage of this? How are you going to prove it? And you think, well, actually, and she said, well, what if he sues? And it's always in the back of your mind, what if X, Y, Z sues? And whenever I do a story, I always have to think, okay, even if you are not on the record, if I am sued, will you get into a witness box? And for instance, I did a long investigation last year into well-known neurosurgeon Charlie Teo, and he sent a letter after threatening to sue. And, you know, his lawyers pointed out there was not a single doctor on the record in my story, which is not from my lack of trying. But before I published, every single one of those, I spoke to 14 neurosurgeons, and every single one said, if you get sued, I will give evidence for you. So we were able to write back and say, yes, just to let you know that if you do decide to sue, we have 14 people who are going to give evidence. So, but it's terrible that that's what journalism is always thinking to yourself, how am I going to prove it in court?
Now, the idea that there are a bunch of quite senior men running around in positions of power and treating women appallingly and forcing themselves on women sexually and making crude remarks and having a bit of a boys' own culture will not be a new fact to any woman in the room. But were you surprised to find that #MeToo became a story, given that we've always known that this behaviour was out there? What do you think tripped it into the arena of being in the public interest that should be taken seriously by a newspaper of the calibre of the Sydney Morning Herald?
Look, I think it goes back to just the culture and the climate of our times. Like, it was, without that Harvey Weinstein story, this would never have happened. And I don't know if any of you have recently seen it's called the Clinton affair. and it's a 3-part, I think it's on Netflix, just looking back at Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. And you see it now through the lens of our time now, and you think Monica Lewinsky was a 22-year-old intern swept up by the President of the United States. Who came out of that badly? She did. She was just absolutely publicly, cast as some, conniving minx using her feminine wiles. And, when you look at it now in a different lens, you think, how have things changed? And I don't know when the cultural shift happened or why, but without that Harvey Weinstein case in the US, that just absolutely tilted society to look at these things in a different way. And, I've had, and I'm sure you have had things in the past, and at the time you just sort of like gave the person a death stare and said, don't ever do that again. But, I just think it's the power imbalance. Like if you're a secretary and the managing director is putting the hard word on you, you're automatically going to think, who are they going to believe, or who are they going to want to believe, me or the managing director? And I just think it's happened forever. But I think now things are changing.
Or also, who are they prepared to lose from the company, me or the managing director? The President of the United States, still Donald Trump. If anyone gets a result, shoot your hand up, won't you? Because we're all dying to hear. But was also accused of sexual harassment many times before he was elected, and it didn't seem to matter. But what was also interesting to me was that the women were largely not believed, in the same way that when President Clinton was accused of sexual harassment, the women were largely not believed, right up until the point of him having to admit that, in fact, with the blue dress and the semen stain, it could no longer be denied. And this week as well, I don't know how many of you are watching the cases that are currently in court, where it seems often that the women are on trial. There's a case involving, I think, some rugby players that are in court at the moment, and the women are being asked to justify, how much did you drink? What were you wearing? Did you go home with him? Does that kind of thing still surprise you, who knows the inside of a courtroom pretty well?
Look, it does still surprise you that, you were wearing a flirty dress, you were looking at so-and-so in a flirtatious manner. That doesn't mean it's acceptable for somebody to rape you. And but then again, it is a court of law and you have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. So as the people accused, you also have a right to the best defence that you can have. It's a difficult balancing act, I think.
We'll move off Me Too in just a moment, but one last question about, so I know that your investigations have included Don Burke, who seemed to most people who worked in the industry to be fairly low-hanging fruit. Like, a lot of people knew that he had been engaged in that behaviour for a long time, and again, it hadn't mattered because he was worth so much to the networks. And then Charlie Teo has also been caught up. With Dyson, the fact that it was Dyson Heydon, a conservative judge, somebody who had always made such a big show of things like propriety and manners and standards, was that the shocking part to you, or really do you think nothing shocks you anymore as to who it might be?
Look, I think I was shocked. Like the fact that this man is one of the preeminent Australian jurists, and also a fairly conservative, rigid kind of man. But, one of the interesting, another interesting person came forward who did not want to be named. She worked for the Liberal Party, and she was invited to a function. It was the Samuel Griffith Society talk, and it was a talk at a law firm after work. There were 40 or 50 people there, and she had just met Dyson Heydon, and someone said, oh, this is Dyson Heydon, former High Court judge. And she said, look, to be honest, I'd never heard of him. And I said, oh, very pleased to meet you. And then the speeches started. they were standing up the back of the room. So she just turned to watch and she said, out of the corner of my eye, I just saw this flash. He put his hand up between my legs at a public function where the speeches had just started. And the interesting thing was, she said, rather than just slap his face, she said, I felt dirty and ashamed, as though I had somehow done something. And she said, I just walked away. I went over, I put my champagne glass down and I left. And she said, and I don't want to publicly complain now because I think it will just get me into trouble. But you think, the absolute brazenness of this. I mean, I think it was those kind of stories that shocked me. And for a while I thought maybe he had dementia. But no, because you think this is really bizarre behaviour. But it turned out that he'd been doing it ever since he was appointed to the bench. So, because you sort of wonder, with someone like him, was he doing it at university? But it seemed only once he got to a position of authority where maybe he thought, who is going to complain against a judge? Probably not. But it still makes me wonder.
Does it strike you as astonishing that men of such enormous capability and intelligence, like Dyson Heydon, I mean, you've read some of his High Court judgments. If you haven't, do it for the sheer pleasure. It's just beautiful. His reasoning,
I don't think so.
His reasoning is gorgeous, and his intelligence is so acute. And also Bill Clinton to be the President of the United States, and yet they are prepared to put it on the line to fiddle with someone.
Is that because they've got away with it for
I
so
don't know,
long?
But are you amazed that they'll risk the first line of their Wikipedia entry being former High Court judge who was accused of sexual harassment? Yep. It seems like a huge risk to take.
I don't know. But one of the funny things about doing this investigation was towards the end of his career, Dyson Heydon started doing separate judgments, because when you do a judgment, usually one person volunteers to write the majority of the judgment, and then you read it and say, I agree with, Kiefel J, blah, blah, blah. But he started demanding to write his own judgments because he could not bear other judges' bad grammar and split infinitives. So I was so nervous. I was more nervous about that part of questioning him because I had to do an email, and I felt like doing a grammar check to make sure that I didn't have any split infinitives. But I must have
dropped your participle.
But it's one of those things that I always find that is the worst part of my job. I hate having to ring up and say, Justice Heydon, it's Kate McClymont here. I just want to put some questions to you about sexually harassing, X, Y, Z. And the thing is that in order to give them, the appropriate time to respond, you can't do it at 5 o'clock and give them 10 minutes to answer. And you also have to detail as much as possible. Did you do X, Y, Z? And you can imagine doing this to a High Court judge. Did you slip your hand? Did you? And the funny thing was, Channel 7 over here. So we had been working on this story.
Not you personally, Mark.
Not you personally. We had been working on this story for 2 years. 2 years. We're just putting the final touches on, and we get a tip off that Channel 7 is about to break the story. They've only got one bit of it, and we just think, no, 2 years. Anyway, so we had to rush it out before their early bulletin. so we did, and I got a lovely text message from the person who was doing the story saying it's only fair, and I couldn't think of anyone who deserved more to pip us to the post after all the work that you'd done once they saw the story. But there's no love in these things. You've got to be first.
One thing you said just then reminded me, when Kate and I worked together at the Herald, there was a saying at the Herald that if you were a slightly dodgy property developer or any kind of young crook in Sydney and you answered the phone and you heard, "Oh, hi, it's Kate McClymont here," you jump out the window.
I know, it's sort of funny because sometimes I ring up and I say, "Oh, it's Kate McClymont here," and I can go, and I have to say really quickly, "I'm just ringing to see if you can help me.
I'm just making a hair appointment." It's all right. Oh. Now, this book, Dead Man Walking, the murky world of Michael McGurk and Ron Medich, it's about the property developer Michael McGurk and the other property developer, Ron Medich. And it was occurring to me when I was reading it, Kate, when you write property developer, do you mean crook? Is that what you actually mean?
I do love journalistic euphemisms. I love the fact that if you're a colourful Sydney racing identity, you're a criminal. If you're a colourful business figure, you're criminal. And it used to be
embattled. Do you remember embattled?
Embattled or disgraced or beleaguered. And it's funny, there's sort of like a progression. You go from embattled, beleaguered to disgraced and then jailed. It's sort of like there's a
and
nice
if you're lucky, released.
And in fact, I was dying to ask Michael Duffy here how my dear friend Ron Medich is going in jail. So, and it's funny, when you deal with these people, I think there is a general assumption that if someone is wealthy, then they've got either street smarts or they're quite clever. Ron Medich, no and no. And he was nicknamed Cotties, being the thick and rich ice cream flavouring. And, I think one of the things I love most about my job is the general level of incompetence and idiocy amongst our criminals. And you realise how the really smart ones get away with it. Because, this book is about the murder of Michael McGurk, who was shot in the head, in front of his 9-year-old son outside his house in the very upmarket suburb of Cremorne. And at the time, it looked like a professional hit. Single shot, back of the head, disappeared into the darkness. In fact, they were two idiots. Like, one of them was a 45-year-old accounts manager at a Pymble accountancy firm, and the other one was his 19-year-old sidekick. So as they lay in wait, they were really nervous, not having been hitmen before. So the kid goes down to the local bottle shop in Spofford Street, and they won't serve him because he's underage. So he goes up, and then the other guy, so two of them, both of them are cited in the bottle shop buying alcohol. So after the murder, they then almost prang the car at the Spofford Street roundabout. They're driving across the bridge without an e-tag, so they get photographed. And then when they get home, they've seen far too many movies because they burn their clothes. But Hassam Safetli, the older guy, forgets that some of the murder money is still in his back pocket. And you just think, how did they get away with it for so long?
Now, in all seriousness, though, no, Kate, Michael, who is the victim in this case, actually called you 10 days before the murder. Is that right? To tell you that he was about to be murdered.
Well, I had lunch with him before that. But it was one of those things that I've always found that having dogs has been very helpful because, people always stop you in the park and tell you stories. So I was walking the dogs at Rushcutters Bay Park, and this guy said to me, "You've got to have a look at this guy, Michael McGurk. He has just firebombed my son's house in Wolseley Road, Point Piper." And of course, my eyes, lit up. Wolseley Road, the 10th richest street in the entire world. So I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So I start looking into it. And there is, in fact, this big legal dispute between property developer Ron Medich and Michael McGurk over this house because, of course, Ron being rich and having a very ambitious wife called Odetta. And in fact, people used to call her Odetta, I wish I'd never met her. But anyway, so, you know,
And
Odetta,
she was married to Coddy's, the
she's
thick,
married
thick
to
and
Coddy's,
rich.
and she's thin and smart. So not thick and rich, thin and smart. So she marries Ron, and Ron's lived for years very happily with his brother in Denham Court with, matching, fake Tudor mansions and pro hearts and the brass taps. And Odetta thinks this is all dreadful. And she thinks, we've got money. We should be living in Wolseley Road. So she uproots Ron from Denham Court, which is out near Campbelltown, to Wolseley Road. So they buy a house in Wolseley Road, and wouldn't you know it, a better one comes up before they've even moved into this one. So they think, okay, we'll offload this one. Normal people might just sell the house. But no. Ron sells it to a friend and then gives him vendor finance. And it's actually it was in Adam Tilley's wife's name. Adam Tilley's wife was the librarian's assistant at Kambala. So I'm not actually sure how she was going to be paying the mortgage of a $14 million house, but there you go. Anyway, so when they don't pay, Ron gets McGurk to start putting the pressure on them. And then, of course, Ron and McGurk fall out. So McGurk still firebombs the house because he's standing to get a success fee if he can get the Tilleys to pay out the money. And you just think, like, he firebombed 3 other houses. He did another one that same day, and he did another one in Balmoral. And
that was going to him having lunch with you?
So we did the story on the firebombing and the lawsuit with Ron Medich. We have lunch at one of Justin Hemmy's places. We meet him for lunch. He slides in, all, beautiful suit, all very, smart, and kept saying, you've got the wrong person. You shouldn't be looking at me. You should be looking at Ron Medich. And then he detailed this incredible outline of who Ron Medich knew and who they were paying and what politicians had done what to whom and what corruption was happening. It was just like this whirlwind. And then he got up and left me with the bill. So, fair enough. But anyway, so he had been charged with the firebombing, and about, 8 days after our lunch, the police dropped it. In fact, the police didn't drop it. It was the DPP. And I sort of think if they'd actually done their job properly. So there's 3 firebombings. The only person who has a connection to all 3 of them, same accelerants, same MOs, is Michael McGurk. But no, the DPP thinks it's too hard, so they drop it. So McGurk is now a free man. Ron is now beside himself with fury that his nemesis is out walking. Anyway, so I write the story about the firebombing charges being dropped. And McGurk rang me up and he was really angry, and he said, stop writing about me. You should be writing about Ron Medich. And he started mentioning a tape that he said he'd had that would bring down the government. And I said, well, look, stop talking about the tape and hand it over. I said, we can't just do a story on Ron Medich because you've got all these unproven allegations. And he said, I just don't think you understand. There's a contract out on me. They're going to have me killed. And I must admit, at the time, I just thought, people tell you all sorts of things. So you can imagine how I felt like 10 days later when he, in fact, is murdered outside his home. But I always felt a bit sorry for Ron because within about an hour, there is the Herald outside Ron's house. And we just followed him everywhere. And I remember the very next morning, Eric Jensen, who is now the editor of the Saturday paper, I can remember, I said, now, go and do this, go and ask Ron what he's been up to. And so Eric shoves
Go
a
and ask the
microphone.
murderer.
Well, I didn't actually. And so Eric Jensen puts a microphone in his face and says, "So, Ron, did you do it?" And I said, "Well, you could have been a bit more subtle." And he said, "Well, I thought that's what I had to say." And I said, "Well," and Ron just said, "You've upset me. You've upset my wife. Now fuck off."
Now, I heard a story, Kate. Now, we all know that media companies have absolutely no money, and you can take that to the bank. They have no money. Nobody has any money. And I heard, Kate, that when after the murders, you received a death threat. And the Herald, like our own company, like Channel 7, nobody has any money, said that they wanted to put you up somewhere a bit safer than your own home. And so they put you up in a motel, and you went there and you kind of looked around and said, "I think I'll take my chances."
That was an earlier death threat. That was after the Canterbury Rugby League going from the top of the table to the bottom of the table because they'd been involved in a salary cap rort. And we got the police rang up and said, "You actually have to get out of your house because there's a death threat." So I rang up the Herald and they said, "Right." I said, "Well, what about we just go down?" I live in Paddington. "You know, what about if we just go down to the Sir Stamford in Double Bay?" "No, not in the budget." I said, "Okay, well, what about the Medina Apartments?" "No, not in the budget." I'm thinking, I'm being told I'm going to be killed any minute. And the Herald is saying, "Not in the budget." So in the end, they rang back and said, "Oh, we've got you a very nice place." And they would an apartment next to the cinema in George Street. It was just so foul. And I remember we stayed there one night, and I remember, as a good mother does, getting the children to check under the bed. And one of the children said, "Mum, there's gold here." I was under there so fast. It was bottle tops. Anyway, so I said, actually, I would rather die. I could be killed right now. So we went home, and they just hired a bodyguard. So,
Now, I got this from Wikipedia.
oh, yeah, right.
But I want to know if it's true. You ready for this? While at university, McClymont set up a busking booth at King's Cross to supplement her income. She answered questions for 40 cents, argued for 50 cents, and charged $1 to verbally abuse you. People also asked for racing tips, and young men asked her to abuse their girlfriends. She said that on Saturday night, she was earning $17 an hour. Is this a true story?
It is a true story.
So tell us about that.
Well, I can't sing and I can't dance. I have no talent whatsoever, but I can talk. So, no, it was great because I had a milk crate for the, the guest, and I had a chair. And if you did anything different in King's Cross, like King's Cross was happening at the time, people would stop and listen. And it was win-win, because if they wanted to argue about it, if somebody from the public wanted to put their 2 cents worth in, you'd say, "Well, put your 50 cents in." So, and I remember one of the working women came along and said, "You've taken my spot and I want you to move." And I said, "Well, look, if you want to argue about it, you'll have to pay 50 cents. Which she did.
You're obviously in quite a good spot.
I know, it was prime position. But the thing was, all these young men would come along and pay $1 and say, "Abuse my girlfriend." And so you would just abuse the girlfriend how could you have such crap taste in having a boyfriend who would do this to you? Dump him immediately.
A lot of the crime that you do, Kate, not all of it, some of it involves property developers, but some of it crosses across the political lines. And of course, here in New South Wales, I mean, the big scalp of yours has been Eddie Obeid, obviously, but in New South Wales the past 2 weeks, although it seems like ages ago, we saw what looked like the beginning of a new scandal involving the Premier herself, Gladys. Tell me, what did you make of it? Like, in particular, her defence, which is that she didn't know, and were you as flawed as everybody else by the idea that Gladys has sex?
But I don't think Gladys has actually answered that.
That she has sex? No,
yes.
She did answer that.
Did
bit.
She? And what did she say? I thought she was just sort of deflecting that.
No, I think she said they had an intimate personal relationship.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean, did you have sex? I mean, we would think an intimate personal relationship was like a colourful Sydney racing identity, but you're just never quite sure.
Well, what do you make of the embattled Gladys?
Oh, I'll just go back a bit and just say that in 2017, I got a call from the said Daryl Maguire. And
that's Dodgy Daryl, who's
Dodgy Daryl,
the lover,
or debonair Daryl from Gladys's point of view. Anyway, so I get a call from Dodgy Daryl saying, and it was all incredibly clandestine, and he wanted to meet me to pass on some information about the Medicas. And I thought, oh, okay. And then I met him at the Western Hotel, and his information was that the Medicas had just sold their block of land at Badgerys Creek to a Chinese company called Doyenne Holdings for $500 million. And I remember saying to him, look, if you don't mind me asking, but how is it that a backbencher from Wagga knows about this? Because there'd only been a caveat registered on the title. There was no way of knowing. And then he said, oh, well, I'm friends with Country Gardens, the other Chinese firm who'd been trying to buy it. He never said, and, you know, maybe I was going to get a huge commission. But I'm surprised that so his phone was being tapped at that time. So I noticed that ICAC quizzed him about Louise Waterhouse and her Badgerys Creek holding, but they didn't ask him any questions about the Medich property and whether he was going to get something out of Country Gardens then. But back to Gladys, I find it really interesting talking to, you know, my group of friends that I know that aren't journalists and aren't political reporters, and every single one of them says, poor Gladys, you know, to have a dud boyfriend. And I always say, but hang on, look, I understand that. But as soon as I hear somebody on the phone saying, I don't need to know that, I think that shows a consciousness of there is something there that you don't need to know. Now, I would never...
Like a plausible deniability.
No, that she knows that there's something going on, but I just want to put that out of my mind. And I would never for one moment suggest that Gladys was corrupt or would do anything. But I find it interesting. And I also find it interesting that once he was exposed at ICAC in 2018 in a separate inquiry as accepting money from Chinese property developers and trying to do their bidding, wouldn't you as Premier then say, I'm sorry, but it's not going to happen? I don't know. There's just something about it.
Were you surprised by the level of sympathy for her? I mean, I'm imagining Barry O'Farrell, as we know, lost the premiership over a bottle of wine. Were you surprised that there was much more willingness to believe Gladys or to give Gladys the benefit of the doubt?
I think there is a residual of goodwill towards Gladys, you know, over the bushfires and over COVID. And also I think a degree of sympathy. I sort of wonder if Gladys had been, you know, a 3 times married, glamorous, you know, divorcee, would we have the same level of sympathy? Like, I think she has played this really well. And it was interesting in the fallout from that. The media that she did an interview with Annette Sharp, you know, one of the gossip columnists with the Daily Telegraph. She didn't do you. She didn't.
She certainly didn't do you.
No, but also she didn't do any ABC. So, and the following morning she did Ben Fordham, and she also did Kyle and Jackie O. And she got an enormous amount of publicity out of those without actually ever being grilled by a political reporter. So I just, you know, I think that they've managed it as well as they can. But I find the whole thing fascinating. And I spoke to a good friend of Daryl Maguire's who was shocked. He said, I see him once or twice a week. I never knew. And you sort of
Well,
think,
her own family didn't know.
No,
Her own
so-
sisters. Amazing.
but
Amazing.
what, was he using her? Like, you sort of think, was he able to get influence by saying to Chinese contacts, I'm very close to the Premier? I don't know. Or was it enough just for him to say, I am a member of Parliament? I'm not sure.
Now it's time for questions. We've got 20 minutes to go. We will not be handing around a microphone because of COVID. So please stand up and speak as loudly as you can. I'm also going to get questions from Zoom, I believe. And if I do have questions from Zoom, I'll have to repeat them to the room. I apologise for that because you won't be able to hear them. Firstly, are there any questions from the room here? We have a lady straight away. Go ahead, as loud as you can. I'm sorry about not having a microphone for you.
I'm
Great.
sure
That's
you
a
all,
great question.
I'm sure you all heard that, and that was what is my relationship like with the police? And look, it depends which area you're talking about. I think having been around for quite a long time, it can work for you and it can work against you. But I think generally the people that I've worked with for years know that if you give your word that you won't breach something or you won't do something, you won't do it. And I think that stands you in good stead. But having said that, the police have become totally obsessed about being seen to leak any information. And sometimes you ring up and just say, look, I just want to check. Did that arrest happen at X or Y? And can you just give me some times? They immediately refer you to the media unit. Like, it's so hard just picking the phone up and talking to a relevant police officer. Everything gets diverted to the media unit. Do you find that?
Absolutely.
It's just really, it makes everyone's job so much harder.
Do we have another question from the room? Yes. If you could say it as loudly as you can. For those on Zoom, that question was about the threats that Kate has faced personally. How does she deal with them?
Look, I find it easier now that my children are adults. It was always, and I think in the wake of that Michael McGurk murder, about 5 days after the murder, I got a death threat delivered to my house. And I must say that made me feel really uneasy, knowing that knowing that somebody knew where I lived. But having said that, I always think it's a form of bullying. And I think would be really bad for the criminal's business for me to be killed and for there to be an investigation. So, and I look, you just say to yourself, if somebody really wanted to kill you, they would. Like, it wouldn't be hard because they know where you work. So you just have to put that out of your mind. In fact, I find it far more challenging for the legal threats that come in. That, like, I think last year I would have spent about 25% of my entire working year tied up with lawyers on defamation actions. At one stage last year, I had 4. And one of them was an ear, nose and throat surgeon who was suing me. I'd done a story about a patient of his whose name was Little Al Taul, and he was a standover man, and he died on the operating table. And it turned out that his friends and family were threatening the surgeon. And then the next week, another one of his patients died on the operating table. And this was such a sad story. The patient that died was a 24-year-old young man whose parents had emigrated from Iraq. And once they got here, his father died. So he was the sole breadwinner. He was 24. He was working 2 jobs and studying to be a pilot. And he had sleep apnea. So all he wanted was to have his sleep apnea fixed so that he could work harder. Anyway, so the surgeon who had a notification on his practicing certificate, which turned out to be for cocaine usage, did an operation in, I think, 22 minutes when it should have taken an hour 20. Never saw his patient after the operation, and the young man bled to death. And it was just so sad. I remember speaking to his mother and his sister afterwards about the catastrophic loss of this young man. And then 6 weeks after he died, they both killed themselves. It was just like terrible. And you think, you know, we write this, sorry, I get upset even thinking about this, but here was this man suing over like his own actions, and now as a result of my stories, he's actually facing a prosecution by the medical authorities. But you know, you can write these things, but often the backstories of what happens to these people is so terrible and sad.
Michael. Yeah, tell us now. Put it out on Zoom. Bring in the lawyers.
Actually, no. there's a story that I've been working on for almost
Kate,
as
you're
long.
on Zoom. You're not just in this room.
I'm not saying it, for almost as long as Dyson Hayden, involving a very prominent figure, and I'm just waiting. I just need one more thing, but I'm a very patient person. No, but there are stories that you just cannot get over the line. The lawyers just say, you know, and you know how you know it's true, but that's just not enough.
I've got a question from our fans on Zoom, one of whom wants to know, have you compared your situation to that of Juanita Nielsen?
Oh, thanks.
I think that, and some context will probably be needed for those who don't know who Juanita Nielsen is.
Juanita Nielsen was an heiress, and she ran a local newspaper in King's Cross, and she fought an incredible battle to preserve King's Cross. And she disappeared in, was it the late 70s?
I was going to say early 70s, late 60s, early 70s.
It's late 70s, and her body's never been found. And I was saying to Caroline as I came in, because of course Caroline is the expert on William Tyrrell and has written a book on his disappearance. And I was saying, I got this email last week telling me that Juanita Nielsen's head was with William Tyrrell's body, and they could find it if they dug up. And you just think, there are a lot of crackpots out there.
There are, but there are also a lot of people. Isn't it funny, though, that almost everyone who's a great whistleblower, a terrific source, is a little bit mad? I mean, it is, they are all a bit crazy, often because there's been trauma. So in particular, if you're talking to people who are investigating child sexual assault, they're almost, or assault within the clergy, they're almost always very damaged people, and you really have to trust your judgment to believe them, right?
And I find that really interesting. I covered the late John Marsden, who was a solicitor, and he was suing Channel 7.
Again, not personal, Michael.
He was suing Channel 7 over really great story suggesting that he was a pedophile. And then he took a defamation action that I still think holds the record. It went for a year. And in the end, he was cleared. But I have no doubt that the original story was correct. And it was watching this and seeing the people giving evidence. And it's the same with people like, senior Catholic officials, is that the people giving evidence against them are damaged. They're not, when I say they're not credible witnesses, a lot of the witnesses in the John Marsden case were homeless. They were eking out an existence as rent boys at the Wall in Darlinghurst. And when you give evidence against, the former head of the Law Society or a senior Catholic figure, it's really, really difficult. And I just think it's so hard getting those cases over the line for those very reasons, is that they've damaged people.
Yeah, they're damaged, and there's often a drug history as well, which makes their memories unreliable, but doesn't mean they're lying. And that's taking a leap of faith, as you so often have. It pays rewards. Do we have more questions from the room? Yes, in the front here.
We had that guy on the front page last week. So Stephanie, I don't know if any of you have read, Stephanie Wood has written this fabulous book called Fake. And it's about her dating disaster with a serious, very strange person. And I remember she used to sit next to me at the Herald, and she'd come in sobbing, saying, he stood me up at the airport. We were meant to be meeting my parents. And I was just saying, just give me his name. And she would say,
so he can jump out the window.
No, she would say, no, I've got to believe in love. And then finally she said, all right, here's his name. It took 20 minutes to find out he had a criminal record. He was a bankrupt. He'd pretended that he was an architect. And last week he was in court, trying something on somebody else. In fact, the person that he was alleged to have tried to extort money from was one of the characters in the Ron Medich, Michael McGurk book. And I just love the way Sydney has got 4 million people, and all the alleged colourful identities seem to know each other. They all have the same lawyers. They all have the same accountants. It just amazes me.
Uncanny. Did you have a question as well? Yes.
I think not being sued. No, it is. I think one of the most satisfying ones has been the Dyson Hayden one, more because of what happened afterwards, and that it really caused a whole lot of institutions to have a look at their own processes, to try to change how things have happened and to make it easier for women to report these things. So it's always a great feeling if you can change society for the better for something that you have done, and you can rarely do that. So that Dyson Hayden was satisfying for what happened afterwards.
Do we have more questions from the room and also more from Zoom? If we'd, yes, we have one. We have another one in the back here. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just missed the middle bit. Did you hear it?
I got it, yes. So the question also for those who are listening on Zoom is, how do you feel about naming people who are involved in court cases before there has been a verdict? Should it apply to people who have been accused and yet not found guilty? And also there are new laws just about to come in Victoria, which will make it a criminal offence for the media to name also the victim, even if she wishes to be named. So we're thinking about rape victims who want to tell their stories in Victoria would not be able to. And also the victims of murder like Jill Maher, also in Victoria, their families would not be able to identify them.
Right. Yes, I find that troublesome in some ways. And look, it's a little bit annoying up here. Like I feel for Hedley Thomas, who did that podcast. That was his own work. And then he's blamed for, adverse publicity. And you think, I'm sorry, he did all that work. and then the person, I mean, we won't name the person, and then the person was charged. And, sometimes I get things from people saying, why should you take it upon yourself to do an investigation when the person hasn't been charged? And you think, that's why I'm doing the investigation. And, that person might never be charged. Dyson Hayden, some of the things that he did constitute a criminal offence, and one of his victims is now a judge. And she said, I don't want to press criminal charges. If I did, every male lawyer that appeared before me defending a rape charge would say that I was biased. So I can understand what you're saying, and I find it similar with the arguments about a federal ICAC, which I think this is the worst legislation that the coalition is proposing. So politicians would never be exposed to a public hearing. Their names would only ever be released if they were criminally charged. And the thing is, you might think, well, that's probably a good idea. But at ICAC here, there is always a private hearing first, so that the evidence is tested, they work out what can be said, what can be proved. So sure as eggs, if they go on to have a public hearing, you know that they know that they've already got it. But in that way, the public can see the process. As the Washington Post says, democracy dies in darkness. And I just think it's really important that we see how investigations unfold, and also people come forward with more information.
They do. I have to make some final remarks now because we're about to wrap up. There will be signed copies available of Kate's book in the State Library Bookshop, which is next to the Library Cafe. A volunteer is here, I believe, to show you the way. Zoom viewers who want to get books can buy them postage free from the State Library Bookshop. All you need to do is just go to the library website and click on the shop tab and go from there. And we ask that you please leave the room at the end of the session, even if your next session is in this room, because it needs to be clean because of the COVID restrictions that we're on. But before we go, I'd like you to please put your hands together for Kate McClymont, really the best of the best.
And thank you all for coming, and thank you for your wonderful questions, Caroline.
Absolute pleasure.